Welcome to Excel 2013 Statistical video number 8. Hey, if you want to download this workbook and follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, in this video, we're going to talk about tabular graphical displays for quantitative variable. And we're going to concentrate our efforts on creating frequency distributions and the chart for frequency distributions with a quantitative variable, histograms. Now, if we're going to build a frequency distribution, remember that's counting. And if we have numbers, our first example is going to be grade data, right? So there's numbers. I don't want a frequency distribution which counts all the zeros, the ones, the twos. So we're actually going to have to build classes or categories for our quantitative variable. So for grades, we're going to go from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, all the way up to 70 to 80, 80 to 90, etc. Then once we have those classes and we count, we'll have our frequency distribution. Then we'll make our histogram, which visually portrays the count for a quantitative variable. We'll also see how to create relative and percent frequency, cumulative frequency, and a chart for that. And we'll briefly mention dot plot and stem and leaf. Now, this sheet, I'm on notes. Our definition for frequency distribution still holds. The one thing for quantitative variable, though, we're going to have to be careful when we create our classes. We have to make sure that we have collectively exhaustive categories or classes. That means enough categories so nothing's left out. And mutually exclusive categories. No one item that we're counting can fit into two categories. Now, as always, you can print out this sheet, and there's notes for all of the things we're going to do in this particular video. But I want to jump ahead to a sheet called grade data. So I'm going to come over to the sheet navigation arrows and right-click, and up pops our list of all of our sheets. I'm going to click on grade data and click OK. Scores on a final. That'll be our first quantitative variable to look at frequency distribution in histogram. Now let's click in the top cell, control down arrow. So we'll have over 400 scores from the last year. Control home to get back to cell A1. And the idea here is we can't just extract a unique list or do a pivot table, which will create the unique list for us, and count, because we'd have way too many rows in our table or columns in our histogram. So we're going to have to build classes. Now, the range for the scores is 0 to 100. And this is an example of a data set where you pretty much can guess that 0 to 10, 10 to 20, all the way up to 80 to 90, 90 to 100, those would probably be pretty good classes. Our next example, we'll see a more detailed way to calculate the number of classes and the width for each class. But here, 0 to 10 would work. We'll also see in our next example that we always have to figure out what the min and max is before we can do anything else. But guess what? We can use the pivot table and the grouping feature. And that feature will not only tell us the min and the max, but it will ask us what the width for each class will be. So when we have a data set like this where it's pretty obvious, let's just use a pivot table. I'm going to click in a single cell. We have a proper data set, insert pivot table, or Alt-NV. Let's go ahead and put this on the existing worksheet. Location, cell C1. Click OK. Now here's one quantitative variable. Watch what happens when we drag it down to rows. You should be already able to guess what's going to happen when I drop it here. Instantly, we get a unique list. That's not at all what we want. But grouping to create classes is as simple as right-click, and there's group. Boom. And look what happens. Starting at, it calculates the min. Ending at, it calculates the max. The by is the increment or the class width. Now, it guessed the class width. We could change it to anything here, but we're going to leave it at 10. Now, that's quite remarkable. And actually, we're going to come back in a second and edit this, because I want to click OK, and I want to notice something about these classes. 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. It looks like what we want, but I have no idea. Is the 10 going to be included here, or is the 10 going to be included here? Now, the way that pivot table grouping works is the upper end is never included. So the 10 will not occur here. It will be included here. The 20, not going to happen here because the 20 is the upper. It's always the lower that's included. Well, if that's the case, what about this last one? 100? The pivot table will actually, for this last class, include a 90 and 100 in this class. I don't like that at all. Now, before we fix the labels and the grouping, I want to prove to you that the 10 is not here, but here, because the 10 is on the lower end. The 20, it's not up here. It's in this class because the 20 is on the lower end. And I want to show you this ambiguous 90 and 100, that both of those numbers show up in this category. Those numbers are here. There's a 10, a 20, a 90, and 100. We're going to take our scores on final and drag it down to the values. And remember, when you drag a number field down to the values, it defaults to sum. Not when you have group numbers. It defaults to count. And isn't that convenient for frequency tables? Now, it says between 0 and 10 we have 18. Between 10 and 20 we have a count of 8. So 8 students got a score between 10 and 20. But now, I want to prove to you that the 10 is here, and the 20 is here, and that there's a 90 and 100. Now, there's an amazing feature in all pivot tables. Remember, what does a pivot table do? It takes all this raw data and summarizes it. But any cell inside the pivot table, if you double click it, it'll actually go back to the data set, extract all of the records that fit into this category, and insert a new sheet and display those records. So watch this. I'm going to double click the 0 to 10, and instantly you see a new sheet. I'm looking through here. Those are all the numbers that match. There's no 10. By the way, that's a pretty profound, cool thing. If you're analyzing data and you need to go quickly look at the source data, man, pivot tables are amazing. Now, I'm going to right-click delete this because I do not want it. It says, do you want to delete it? I want to delete it. Now, watch this. Remember, if there's a 10, it better be here. Double-click. And sure enough, boom, it is. Right-click delete, and then say delete. So the 10 is because there's a lower limit there. Here, if I double-click this, the 20 that's in this data set, sure enough, delete that sheet. The 20 is there because the 20 is on the lower end. So remember, the upper end of each one of these classes is not included. Now, let's come down here, double-click, and this is what I don't like. I don't know how. There's the 100 and the 90. I don't like that at all. Right-click delete. So we're going to fix it. If we're going to use pivot tables, because they're much faster and easier than the formula equivalent, I want to fix it. So the first thing is I'm going to right-click in the row area and go back to group. And since I know there's 100 in there, I'm going to make the upper end 110. Now, all of the classes or categories will be exactly the same. There'll be an increment of 10. The upper limit will not be included. The lower limit will. So when I click OK, I'm going to get a slightly different distribution. But watch this. When I come here and double-click, the 100 is not here. The 90 is, and that matches our consistent category. Lower end is included. Right-click delete. And if I double-click this, so there's 3. Yes, because the maximum score is going to be 100. Right-click delete. Now, we could do something different with formulas where we have the last class that's slightly different. But I like the consistency here of our labels. Now, that's getting close to our frequency distribution. But I'd like unambiguous labels. So I want to edit every one of these labels. Instead of clicking in each cell and hitting F2 and actually typing out something, watch this. We're going to do a great trick. Find and replace. I want to find that dash and replace it with up to. So I'm going to go to the Home ribbon, over to the Editing group, Find. When I click Replace, it's going to ask me, find what? I'm going to find a dash, and then replace with, I'm going to type space, up space to space. And now when I click Replace All, it will replace all. Now, because I've pre-selected a bunch of cells, it will only find and replace throughout that selected range. replace all, and OK, close. I like that much better. Now we have unambiguous categories. All of the upper and lowers are consistent. There's our frequency distribution. Let's click up here. Test scores tab, and then frequency. We have our frequency distribution. I'm going to close the field list. Now we can create a histogram. Now, this is quantitative data. Insert. Charts. Hey, we're going to use the column just like we did for our categorical data. But guess what? When we get our columns, we're going to change the gap width to 0. Now, before I do that, I'm going to come up and right-click, hide all field buttons on chart. I'm going to delete this legend, chart junk, delete. I'm going to click on the title and simply start typing. You could see up in the formula bar as I type, count of test scores on final over last year. And when I hit enter, that appears in our title. Click on the columns, Control-1 to open up our task pane. Change the gap width. I'm going to go over to the bucket. If you're going to keep all of the columns the same color, one way to distinguish between each column is to go to Border, Solid Line. Come down here, I'm going to select black. If I were to click out here, you can see that really helps to distinguish. I kind of like to go to Fill. Notice when I go to Fill and I don't have the column selected, it's not going to do much. Now that I have it selected, I can go to Fill, Vary Colors by Point. Close the task pane. Here's our plus. We're going to add data labels at the top. I love that. We don't need this vertical axis anymore. Delete. I'm going to get rid of the horizontal lines. Delete. We do need a label at the bottom, the plus. Axis titles. Delete. Select the horizontal axis. Equal sign jumps us up to the formula bar. I'm going to click in cell A1 and enter. There we have it. Point to the edge of the histogram and click and drag. And there we can see we have a histogram and our frequency distribution. Now, what is the idea here? We want to see the shape of the data. Because it's quantitative and the order of these categories means we're getting smaller to bigger. Wow, check that out. You can really see the shape. Most of the scores are right in the middle between 70 and 80. It almost looks bell-shaped. And we'll talk a lot more about distributions and bell shapes as the chapters evolve. But think about where we came from. We have 400 scores. And with our frequency distribution, and in particular our histogram, we can clearly see the shape and pattern of this data from raw data into useful information. Now, before we move on to our next example on the data sheet, I want to notice something about these numbers. They are decimals. And when we dumped them into a pivot table and grouped, it gave us 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. There's a 20 in the upper limit of this class and the lower limit. In our next example, we're not going to have decimals. We're going to have integers. And we'll notice that the grouping does something slightly different and more polite. So let's go over to the sheet Data. Now, this is a sample of 200 sales from www.boomerang.com. We have a proper data set, transaction number, date, coupon, payment method, region, price, units, amount of the transaction, boomerang product, customer age, and range of the flight of the boomerang. Now, we're going to analyze customer age. And what we'd like to do is group and see the number of people in certain groups, like 0 to 10, 10 to 20. Now, we're not going to do 0 to 10 because we're going to search through, find the min and max. And in this example, we're actually going to calculate the number of classes and the width of each class. So let's go over to the sheet FD Quant Age. Here's our ages from our data set. Control down arrow. We can see that there's about 200 records here. Control home. That gets us back to cell A1. Now we're going to have 3 steps. Determine the number of classes, the width of the class, and then the lower limit for the first class. Now let's go ahead and start by calculating the count and the max and the min those are kind of the general parameters for this calculation. Well, we certainly need to know the count, so we're going to use count function, which will count numbers. Click in the top cell, Control-Shift down arrow, Shift-Enter to put the formula in the cell and shift the cell up. Now watch this. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to highlight by clicking on that and Control-C. I'm going to use it 2 more times. Equals max. That calculates the biggest. Control-V, Enter. And the min. Control-V, those are the ranges, and Enter. Now look at this. The oldest person who bought a boomerang at our website was 69 years old. The youngest was 18. Now let's start with step 1. We're going to use this formula. 2 raised to the k, where the k is the number of classes, has to be greater than the n, which is the count of all the records. So we're going to start by estimating our number of classes. And I'm just going to start with the number 6. And now we do our formula. Equals 2 caret, which is exponent, Shift 6. And we're going to have it point to that cell with our estimation, Enter. Now the question is 64 greater than 200? It is not. So we have to raise this up. I'm going to try 7. 128 greater than 200? I don't think so. 8. 256? That is bigger. So our formula is helping us as a starting point. So later, the shape of the data might not look right, and we come and change this. Or even our calculations here might force us to come back and change this. But for now, that's our starting point. Now for the width of the classes, well, we have the max and the min. So a next logical calculation would be to figure out the difference. Equals the max minus the min. 51. So whatever range of classes we create, it better cover 51 years. Now, from this 51 years and the number of classes, we can estimate an approximate width equals, hey, the whole range and divide it by our 8. 6.375. Well, we certainly wouldn't want to use a decimal like that. So how about we estimate? And this is a judgment call just like this was up here. I'm just going to push it up to 7. Because we pick a number bigger than when we actually calculate the range for our classes, which is equals the width that we've determined times the number of classes we've determined. Because that 7 is bigger than that, it'll automatically cover the 51 years. The only trick now is, how do we split up the difference? Because if I started the first class at 18, that means the difference of 5 would show up in the last class. I'm going to try 16 for our lower limit. So I'm going to type 16. This is a judgment call too. So there we have it. We know we're going to start at 16. The class width is 7. And the number of classes is 8. Now, if we're going to use a pivot table, all we're going to need to do is we'll have to change the min to 16. And when we put the class width of 7 in, it'll automatically calculate 8 classes for us. Now, let's go over here and build our pivot table. Remember, these are integers. So when we create our pivot table, we're going to see something new about grouping. So I have one cell in our data set, Insert, Pivot Table, or I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-N-V. I'd like to put this on a new worksheet, so I simply click OK or hit Enter. There's our new worksheet. I'm immediately going to double click and call this Age, Frequency Distribution, and Histogram. Enter. Now, let's go ahead and take our customer age and drag it down to rows. And instantly, we get a unique list of our ages. Now we can come over and right-click Group. There's our min. We want to change that to 16. The ending, we do not have to change that, because as soon as we do our increment or class width or by, we change it to 7. As soon as we click OK, boom, look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the increment for each is 7. But check this out. We do not have ambiguous labels. 16 to 22, 23 to 29. Because it's an integer, the pivot table knows there's no number between 22 and 23. So it automatically creates much more polite labels here. That always will happen with integers. The way our last pivot table grouped will always happen with decimals. Now we simply come over and drag our age down to values. There's our frequency distribution. We can rename the columns, age, tab, frequency, and enter. That is absolutely amazing. Now we can create a histogram. I don't need this field list anymore, so I'm going to close it. Click in a single cell, insert. We want a column, clustered column. Now let's fix this up. Right-click, hide all field buttons. We can delete the legend. That's chart junk. We can click on the title and immediately start typing. When we type, it appears in the formula bar, count of boomerang purchased by age, and enter. We'll build a slightly different histogram than our last one. We'll actually keep our vertical axis for the frequency count here. We'll click on the columns, right-click Format Data Series or Control-1. That opens up the task pane. We want to change the gap width to 0. Instantly, we get no gaps. Now, check this out. This is integer, right? It's still a continuous variable because when you're doing age, we're measuring. We could count in years, in half years, third of a year, quarter year, months, days, minutes, seconds. So this is still a continuous variable. But many continuous variables do have integer categories, and certainly the grouping is easier. Hey, we have our columns. We're not going to change the columns, but I do want to come over to the fill bucket, and I want the border solid line and make sure it's black. It is. That is a nice way to differentiate between the columns. Now, let's click on the chart and go to our plus. We're not going to do data labels because we already have our count here, but we do want axis titles. I don't want one here. Delete. The title up at the top tells us that it's a count. But I would like to click on here and type age categories and enter. So there's our finished histogram when analyzing the ages for boomerang purchases. Wow, look at that. We span many different age categories. Certainly, we can see the tallest ones are in the younger groups. But look at this. A lot of older customers are buying boomerangs. So we see the shape of the data is not quite as peaked as our last set of data. In fact, let's go back to grade data. Notice if I close this right here, the shapes tended to be more bell-shaped with a little extend to the left. So the frequency distribution and the histogram, they have a continuous variable across here. And the order here matters. It's from smallest to biggest, right? Same with our ages. And then we have the height of the columns. So together, it tells us the shape and distribution of the count of our data across our categories. That's really important in statistics. Now, I want to go look at a couple other examples on the sheet Skew. Now here, this is test scores. This is a different set of test scores. And notice up at the top, in the higher categories, we have the higher counts. And then it tails off to the left. This is called skew to the left or negative. Down here, these are housing prices. Housing prices, there's maybe a few big values up at the top, but most of the housing prices are going to be on the lower end. This is called skew to the right or positive. Now, this is going to be important throughout the rest of our class. Next chapter, we'll actually calculate skew, and we'll talk a lot about averages, including the mean. Now, what happens? This is a count of all the values for test scores, right? But what happens when you calculate an average and there's a few really small values? It brings the mean or the average down. With the house example, if you have a few really expensive houses and you calculate the average, it would tend to pull the mean or the average up. That's why we say when there's a skew, it's to the left or negative because it'll pull the mean down. To the right, it pulls the mean up. This is an example of more of a bell shape, human height. Other bell-shaped distributions are like SAT scores or filling a box of cereal. Again, it's the histogram and the shape of the data that tells us that it's bell-shaped. Most of the values are occurring in the middle. Another example of a distribution that we can figure out from a histogram is bimodal. This is a situation where the testing Either people did really bad or they did really well. Now, I have this randomized. So if you go on this sheet Skew and you hit the F9 key, you could see the data is changing. But look, this testing data always tends to be a bunch at the top, and then it's skewed to the left. This is human height. So if I hit F9, it tends to be bell-shaped. And you can think about human heights. Most of the people are right in the middle. Here's the housing prices, F9. Ooh, there's a couple $1 million houses that are pulling the mean up. So in this chapter, we learned how to do frequency distributions and histograms to reveal the shape. In later chapters, we'll do more with these distributions. Now I want to go back over to the FD Quant Age, and I'd like to build a new pivot table. And in fact, I'm going to move this. Here we did just our frequency distribution, but watch this. I'm going to click here, and we're going to create a new pivot table and do a few other calculations. Insert pivot table, or Alt-NV, and then Enter to put it on a new sheet. Double click, and we'll call this, I called it Age Frequency Distribution, Relative Frequency and Percent Frequency, and Enter. We'll drag our age down to rows. Ooh, and watch what happens. We already took data from this sheet one time. The actual data is cached. That means stored in memory, and it remembers that it was grouped. Now, for us, that's pretty convenient. Other times, that's kind of annoying. But now, watch this. We're going to drag our age 1, 2, 3 times down to values. We're going to close this. We're going to rename Age Frequency Tab, Relative Frequency Tab, Percent Frequency, Enter. Hey, the frequency's looking fine. Let's come over to Relative Frequency. Right-click in this column. Show Values As. And that is so cool. Percent of column total. Boom. Now, this is supposed to not have number formatting. Right-click, Number Formatting. And we're going to change it to number. 2 decimals is fine. Click OK. Right-click, Show Values As. Percent of column total. Right-click, Number Formatting. And let's decrease the decimals to show 0. Age grouped up. Frequency, relative frequency, and percent frequency. Fast and easy when we have a pivot table. Now, our next example, we want to see how to do this with a formula and see some advantages for formulas. So let's go scroll over, and we're going to go find the sheet FD and H, frequency distribution and histogram formulas. Now, here's a slightly different set of scores on the final. And the thing about this data set is that there's exactly 28 scores. And for the class size, we always get 28 or fewer scores. So what we're going to do is we're going to build with formulas, the frequency distribution, and histogram. We're going to see a couple advantages to building the actual class categories with formulas. And we'll see that later when we have other classes, we'll dump various scores in and results and see that everything automatically updates. Now, I've already calculated the min, the max. And since this is a score, 0 to 100, I'm just going to automatically start at 0. And the class increment or class width will be 10. Now, we'll start by building the lower limit and the upper limit. And I've actually colored this cell slightly different because this will be a lone formula. I'm simply going to say equals the start value of the first class, tab. This formula will be equals relative cell reference 1 to my left plus locked on the increment F4 key to lock that. Control Enter. I'm going to copy it down 1 cell. And now I'm going to make a new formula that will copy all the way down. Remember, when we have a lower and an upper, where the lower is going to be included but not the upper, we're going to go ahead and have the lower end look the same as the upper. So this is a relative cell reference, 1 up and 1 over. Control Enter. Now, when I copy this down, and I'm not sure how far I go, I'm just going to copy it a bunch. And as we saw earlier in the video, I'm going to make sure and include 110 as the upper limit. And I'd like to remove these, so I'm going to go up to Home and the eraser. I'm not using the delete key because the delete key only removes the content. I want to clear all. That removes the content and the formatting. All right, now let's build our category or class label that we can use in our histogram. Equals, and I'm going to say the lower, and join this to. And text in a formula has to go in double quotes, space up, space 2, space end double quote. So far, I've joined some text in double quotes and a cell reference. Now I need to join another item, ampersand, shift 7, and I get the upper. Control Enter. And now I'm going to copy this down. Now we can do our frequency. And this is going to involve count ifs, because we need to, in our count ifs, have greater than or equal to the lower, because the lower will be included, and less than the upper. So you ready? Equals count ifs. Criteria range, we're going to have to repeat it twice. Control Shift down arrow F4, comma to get to the next argument. The criteria, remember we need our comparative operator in double quotes, greater than or equal to, end double quotes, and we have to join it to the lower end. Remember, this whole construction means it's looking over to the data set, and only when it finds something bigger than, that bigger than sign is pointing towards all the numbers. So anything that's greater than or equal to 0 will get a true and be included. But we have a second condition, comma, and we're going to repeat this. Watch this. I'm going to click Control-C, click, and Control-V. Comma, our second condition, double quote, less than, end double quote. Notice we are not including the equal sign, join, and the upper. Now we have a second condition. So when these two conditions look through the column, it's only when the big side is pointing over here and it finds one that's greater than or equal to 0, and the less than is pointing over here, and the item is also less than the upper, which in this case is 10. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. And there's our count, our frequency. Now we can calculate percent frequency. Oh, but we better come down here and give ourselves a total. Tab, Alt equals, and Enter. So for this particular class, we had the full class filled with 28. Later, when we dump some new data in there, we'll have sometimes less than 28. Now I'm going to highlight these two cells and Control-1 to open up Format Cells. And as we did before, I want to do borders. I don't see that the lines are everywhere, so I'm actually going to hit Outline and Inside to start. And then on top of it, I'm going to select the medium thick, click on the top. Double border, click on the bottom. Click OK. I'm going to use Control-B too, so I'm fully differentiating the bottom of this from the rest. Now the percent frequency we can calculate equals one cell to the left, the frequency for this category, divided by the total, and F4 to lock it. Control-Enter, put it in the cell, keep the cell selected, and click and drag down. Now I'm going to come down below and Alt equals. I better get 1. Highlight all of these, and this is going to be percent frequency. So I'm going to go to Home, drop down, percentage with 2 decimals showing. I think I missed. I'm going to click right here, go back to Home. I should have highlighted all of them. Boop. So there we get 100%. Now we want to highlight the labels for our horizontal axis. And using Control, I'm going to highlight the frequency column only, not including the total. Now we can go to Insert, Column, Clustered Column. Click on the title and immediately start typing. Histogram for class final test scores, and Enter. Click on the horizontal grid lines, delete. Click on the vertical axis, delete. Click on the columns, right-click Format or Control-1. Notice the Control-1 formats the cells and the chart elements. So that's kind of a universal keyboard. Now we go over to make sure it's on the columns, gap width 0. I'm going to go over to Fill, and I'm going to vary colors by point. I want to go down to Border, Solid Line. Even with the colors, having this black is kind of nice. Now we can close our task pane. Let's click on our plus. We want data labels. So we have those at the top. Axis titles. Click on the axis title. I'm just going to type count and enter. Sometimes you could put frequency, sometimes count. Click on the horizontal axis equal sign to jump up to the formula bar. I'm trying to use the wheel on my mouse and it's not going up, so I'm going to come over to the scroll bar. Now I click on cell A1. I can see that I have my formula and enter. So I've linked that over to cell A1. Now we have our finished histogram. We can clearly see the shape. It looks like kind of a bell shape with a little extension to the left or negative, right? A few small values are pulling the mean down. Now, I'd actually like to change this histogram and make it even cooler than it is. And I'd like to change the categories here, which is something we can do more easily with formulas than we can in a pivot table. Now, I'm going to click and drag the edge over here. The first thing I want to do is I'm noticing that this is 0 to 100. Well, I have this whole extra class here. And in a pivot table, we wanted to get them totally the same. But with the formula, notice that's a formula. This is a formula. These are all formulas here. And I want to change this last category. I added some formatting over here just for myself, so I know within this table that's a different formula from the rest. So I'm actually going to do the same right to these. Right-click, fill. That one right there. Now, I just want to actually have this last category, since the only number that can go into here is 100. I want to leave it that way. So I'm going to, in this cell, type equals and click on that cell right there. Now, actually, this formula is always still going to be looking up there. So watch this. I'm going to copy this down here because it's the same. I'm using color to help me, the author of this, understand how the formulas are orientated in the table. I don't need that one at all, so I'm going to delete it. And finally, this one, I need to change the formula because this is counting with 2 conditions. So watch this. I'm going to cheat. I'm just going to come here and edit this, delete. I only have one criteria. It's exactly equal to 100. Control Enter, so we get a count of 1. And look at that. It looks a little bit funny, but if I'm using this, I clearly know these have ranges, but this is my count just for the people who get a perfect score. There was 1 in this class. Now, here's how we're going to make this histogram even cooler. These are frequencies coming from the cells right here. But what I'd like is I'd like to put the percent frequencies, the data from the cells, up at the top of each column, and then add this axis with the frequency information back in. Let's click on the chart, the plus. To get the axis back in, I'm going to uncheck this. Now they're both removed. I check it back. And now 1, 2, they're back. Now for the data labels, I'm going to hover over. I better scroll over here. I'm going to hover over the data labels, click on that arrow, More Options. The task pane pops up. And no way, values from cells. I'm allowed to link through label options, values from cell. When I check this, immediately this dialog box pops up. I highlight these, click OK. Now, that's a little cluttered. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over and uncheck value, close the task pane. Now, that's a little cluttered still, so I'm going to come over and actually format the cells to show no decimal places. I can go up to Home, and actually this percentage symbol right here, that adds percentage number format with 0 decimals showing. Now, our histogram is looking great. Our formulas are working. Let's go ahead and change the data. So it's next quarter, right? And we want to see what the class distribution is. Now, I'm going to open up my clipboard. I have a few data sets already added here. So I'm going to click Boom, all of our formulas work, and look at our histogram. Completely different distribution. Most of the people are still in the 70 to 80 range. I think it was 24% last time, 43% now. They're all clustered around here with a few small ones down at the bottom. Now still, we have another set of data. Boom. This time we get our set of data, not quite 28 in the class. This looks more like the first one, right? The first one was 24% in this one, 30% now. No 100s, right? Still yet another data set. Here's this one. Wow. This one looks almost uniform. In chapter 5 or 6, I think it is. I think 6 we'll talk about continuous distributions. And one of the distributions is uniform. That means they all tend to be the same in all the categories. This does not usually happen with test scores. Although, I tell you, of all the years I've been teaching, I have had 1 or 2 situations incredibly unusual like this. So, formulas, histograms, great when your source data is changing. So in this video, we talked a lot about frequency distributions. We saw how to do it with formulas. We saw over on Quant Age how to calculate the actual number of classes and the width for each class. We saw how to use pivot tables, and they are the way to go most of the time. Here we used age data frequency, relative frequency, and percent frequency. Over here, we had age data, and we did a histogram. We also did our grade data, where we used a pivot table, and we did our histogram. All right, next video, we'll talk about cumulative frequencies. All right, we'll see you next video.